Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, James McClure and Scott Mingus, authors of The Dogs of War in Our Midst.
Our guests on PA Books today are Scott Mingus and James McClure, and they are the authors of this book, The Dogs of War in Our Midst, Civil War Perspectives from York County, PA. Jim McClure, we'll start with you. For people who are not familiar with it, where is York County?
York County is 50 miles north of Baltimore, just sitting on the Mason-Dixon line. And that's significant because we have, we've historically been north and south oriented versus east and west, with the Susquehanna River kind of hard to get across to get to Philadelphia. We kind of evolved north and south. And then we have before 1800, we had a 65-mile border with the South, the Mason-Dixon line. After 1800, Adams County split off, and now it's still a 45-mile border. So we're really, you could say that we're a northern county with a southern exposure, or a southern county with a northern exposure, however you want to think about it.
Scott, at the time of your book, what was the area like? I mean, if you had wandered around York County in 1863, what would you have seen?
Well, this county would have been quite rural in that area. There were a lot of mills, a lot of farms, heavily agrarian society, dotted with fairly small towns. York was the largest community, in fact, then and now, between Baltimore and Harrisburg, 8,600 people. There are only two towns, though, in York County that were roughly 1,000 apiece. That was Wrightsville and Hanover. And everything else was just small little farming villages and farming communities, with a couple improved highways. So at least what's today US Route 30, as well as the north-south main highway that went to between Harrisburg and Baltimore, were all improved. But much of the county was small, rural, back country roads.
And a feature of the county as well was, a very important feature was an early north-south railroad that between Baltimore and York, then Harrisburg, the Northern Central Railway. And that kind of strengthened our ties with the South. Now that railroad also went east towards Lancaster and of course north towards, but that was important in the Civil War as a way of transporting troops and so on.
And the other railroad route, just to finish that, ran from Hanover Junction in southern York County west through Hanover onto Gettysburg.
How far from Gettysburg is the city of York?
At the time, it was a borough of York at the time. It had Chief Burgess as mayor, and it's about 30 miles. And it's often, I don't know if this is scientifically done or was intentional, but it's in at least this part of Pennsylvania, all the county seats are about 30 miles away from each other. And I think it probably makes sense because they didn't want market centers to be competing against each other. So there might have been a tendency to space them out.
Was the Underground Railroad much of a presence in York County before the war?
Yeah, it's fairly significant. I've written 2 books on the Underground Railroad in York County as well, and some scholars actually will tell you that the Underground Railroad, the term, originated between Lancaster and York counties, although Ohio and some other places will take exception to that. But there were literally, thousands of freedom seekers who came through York County over a 40 to 60 year period. And there were a number of conductors and agents in the Underground Railroad in York County. In fact, I can identify in one of my books a list of some 50 to 55 different names of people that we believe were involved.
If you look on a map of where enslaved people were at the time of the Civil War, there's a kind of a gray plume that is facing really towards York County in the Susquehanna, meaning the density of population of enslaved people was heavier in Maryland, Northern Virginia, and even counties that are bordering York County Hartford County, for example, was 10% enslaved people. And then you go down to, let's say, Howard County, and it might have been 30% enslaved. So there's a heavy, bottom line is there's a heavy population of enslaved people within really a day's walk of York County.
Did slavery still exist in York County in 1863?
No, the last slave in York County died actually in the early 1840s near Hanover. Pennsylvania had actually had outlawed slavery after the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. That law basically made it illegal to hold anybody in bondage unless you had a license and paid certain taxes on it every year. So if you did that, you could maintain your slave. But following that law in 1780, there was a 28-year period in which people who were held in bondage against their will could be indentured. But at the end of that period of time, by 1808, unless you were paying the taxes, slavery was essentially dead in York County. We started with some 600 or so in the late 18th century, and they were down to less than a dozen by 1820.
Yeah, the 1790 census has, as Scott was saying, has the enslaved population in York County at about 499. Then it had an equal freed black population. So York County was second to Philadelphia in 1790 in the number of African Americans in their county. Now at that time, York County went all the way over through Adams County, but it was so York County, had a connection with freed people and enslaved blacks as well.
If someone was using the Underground Railroad to escape from the South and they made it to York County, where would they go from there? What was the route beyond York County?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brian. There were a couple points. One was York County was not a place to stay. In the early days of the Underground Railroad, it was fairly safe, but as time went on and more slave catchers, or to use an old term, a slave hunter, came into this county, it became fairly clear you need to move people across the Susquehanna River. So a key part of the Underground Railroad network here in York was the ability to get people either east to Wrightsville or north towards Harrisburg, Middletown Ferry, et cetera, and get people into Dauphin or preferably Lancaster counties. And then from there, they would move them typically either to Philadelphia or north eventually towards New York, especially as the Underground Railroad developed in the 1840s and 50s, particularly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, moving folks to upstate New York and on to Canada became more important.
Were there examples you found of kidnapping of free blacks in York County and taking them south?
Yeah, I mean, the one that's probably the most prevalent, probably the best known, was a situation that occurred with a lady by the name of Margaret Morgan. She had been born enslaved in Maryland. She had gotten married, lived in Pennsylvania with her freeborn husband, and believed she had been set free by a family that owned her legally in Maryland. But it turns out she actually legally had not been freed. They never issued any paperwork. So when her owner, a guy named John Ashmore, died, his son-in-law and his widow made plans to come to Pennsylvania. They hired a professional slave catcher and an attorney and two other individuals. So 4 people came into Lower Chancery Township in the southeastern part of York County, grabbed her and her 6 children and brought them back to Maryland. Make a long story short, this ended up as a legal case between Maryland and Pennsylvania because their laws at the time disagreed on the idea of freedom. In Pennsylvania, if you stayed here for 6 months, you were free. If you were born in Pennsylvania, you were free. By Maryland law, if you were enslaved in Maryland, no matter where you lived, you were still enslaved, and all children of an enslaved mother remained a slave. So those laws conflicted, and they finally decided to let this play itself out in the Supreme Court, which ruled in Maryland's favor. And unfortunately, the lady, Margaret Morgan, and her children disappeared from history, presumably having been sold into slavery into the Deep South after being returned to Maryland.
How did York County feel about Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election?
Yeah. York County is a border county, and in that way, as we've already talked about a little bit, kind of conflicted. And so it tended to choose a middle ground type of approach, the Copperhead position, the peace Democrat position. On the one hand, you had the abolitionists, and then on the other hand, you had those that were solidly behind slavery. York County in the main tended to be in the middle. They would say, we don't have enslaved people here. Why should we fight a war over it? And Abraham Lincoln stands for war. And so we're not going to back them. Just let us alone. It's not our issue. That's a Southern issue, not our issue. And so it was whenever the two elections involving Abraham Lincoln, in both elections, county voters voted against Abraham Lincoln. In fact, in 1864, the margin against him was greater than in 1860.
Yeah, and to add to what Jim said earlier as well, one thing that's important to realize about York County, to Jim's point about this being a north-south county, is those townships along the Maryland border voted extremely heavily against Lincoln for the Democratic candidates, either John C. Breckinridge or Stephen Douglas in 1860 or George McClellan in 1864. The farther north or east you got in York County, the more Republican support there was. So by the time you got to the townships along the Susquehanna River or in the northern portion of the township or county, closer to places like Dillsburg and Rossville and Wellsville, that area, Franklintown, those townships tended to vote more Republican. But as a whole, because there were far more people living in the southern part, and the feeling in and around York was more middle ground or pro-Democrat, Lincoln did not carry the county in either election.
Yeah, the Democrat candidate who received the most votes in the county, Breckinridge, John C. Breckinridge, was also the favorite in the South. There's only a couple Pennsylvania counties that backed Breckinridge, and York County was one of those.
And Jim, you mentioned the term Copperhead. What does that mean?
Well, it means a peace Democrat position. It's a position that was that just wanted a negotiated settlement. Didn't want war the first. Union as it was, Constitution as it is, and the Negroes where they are as the word they used.
So when the occupation came in 1863, or the Civil War was approaching, the Confederates were on their way. First of all, where were the Confederates headed when they came into York County? Where did they come from, and where were they going?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, Robert E. Lee on June 3rd, 1863, sent his army northward. Their goal, of course, was to head to Pennsylvania. On June 23rd, part of Lee's army was split off under about 6,600 men under Major General Jubal Anderson Early, and they were headed east across the turnpike towards Gettysburg and on to York. Now, Early's orders were to burn the bridge at Wrightsville, but because the state militia was so utterly inefficient, to use the words he did, he decided to go to Wrightsville and capture the bridge and head into Lancaster County, mount his men on 1,000 horses, and head towards Harrisburg. So that's what he tells in his post-Civil War writings. But short term, their immediate goal was to capture York, ransom York for as much money as they could possibly get, capture supplies, obviously break apart that road that led to Maryland, and also break apart the railroads as well. And a key part of their goal, of course, was to grab supplies, Pennsylvania being relatively free from warfare.
Were they on their way to Harrisburg or Philadelphia, or how big was their goal?
On June 23rd, Robert E. Lee sent a word to Lieutenant General Richard Stoddard Ewell in Chambersburg and told him, and I quote, capture Harrisburg if it comes within your means. So Lee didn't have any firm plans to capture Harrisburg. His number one goal was to engage the Union Army in Pennsylvania and defeat it on an open battlefield. If he happened to take Harrisburg, that was something of benefit. Now, Lee's orders can be construed that he really did want to take Harrisburg. Ewell, his subordinate, headed that way while Early headed towards York. And in fact, just right down the road here from the PCN studios, there were a couple small battles fought as the Confederates approached Harrisburg.
How many troops were they bringing with them?
Ewell's corps was more than 20,000 men. He kept roughly 2/3 of those for himself, 2 of his 3 corps, while sending again 6,600 of his men east on today's U.S. Route 30 towards York. So we're talking about 20 to 22,000 Confederates actually came into Pennsylvania between June 20th and June 23. The vanguard, of course, of the 70,000 that Lee would bring in total to bear at the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah, we count 11,200 Confederates in York County through that duration of the Gettysburg Campaign. That's about 1 out of 7 of every Lee's troops. York at the time had a population of 8,600, the borough of York, and early had about 6,600, the main division coming through York. So it overwhelmed York. It overwhelmed York County.
How'd they know where they were going? Did they have maps?
Yeah, that's a great story because obviously in 1862, the goal was to come to Pennsylvania. In fact, Stonewall Jackson had a plan that he disclosed to a Confederate congressman that if you give me 36,000 men, I'll take the war to the banks of the Susquehanna River. And he had convinced Lee throughout the summer of 1862 to come to Pennsylvania. And that was the goal back in the September of 1862 during that invasion. So they had started preparing maps of Pennsylvania even then. But in February of 1863, Jackson famously told a cartographer named Jedediah Hotchkiss, make me a map of the Valley of Virginia through Pennsylvania and keep it a profound secret. So there were teams of spies that came into 5 or 6 counties here in south central Pennsylvania who were sounding the fords on the Susquehanna River. They were spying on the leading roads. They were taking notes on where the chief farmers were, where the industry was. So there was a very extensive spy network. And Hotchkiss did produce a very detailed map, including the names of almost every key farmer. And that map still exists even today, and copies were distributed to his leading generals.
Did York County or anywhere in Pennsylvania have defenses? I mean, did these Confederate soldiers meet any resistance on their way up?
Yeah, the governor of Pennsylvania had called out 50,000 volunteers at Abraham Lincoln's request. Only got 7,000 volunteers, but he organized them into 7 relatively equal regiments of Pennsylvania volunteer militia that were due to serve for the duration of the emergency. But that wasn't enough. He needed far more troops. So he ended up contacting the Democratic governors of New Jersey and New York, Joel Parker and Horatio Seymour, respectively, and they had standing state National Guard units that were already in existence, that were formal groups or organizations, where Pennsylvania, by law, did not have standing militia. You just called them out when you needed them, and they were pretty much volunteers. So more than 10,000 New York National Guardsmen actually ended up coming here to the Harrisburg, Camp Hill, Lemoyne area. And in fact, the 2 Civil War battles I alluded to that were fought here in Cumberland County, where we stand, were basically done by New York and Pennsylvania State Militia. They also had small engagements at Wrightsville. There were engagements that happened in Franklin County as well, in the southern area near Greencastle. So the state militia tried, but they were facing veterans that kind of overwhelmed them in skill, quality, and combat experience.
There's no secret, is in the newspapers and telegraph that the Confederates were coming. And it was some, in York County at least, it was a point of great frustration to some folks who tried to generate defenses and so forth against, the Confederates. They tried to get entrenchments dug and just tried to be generally prepared. And it was kind of this middle ground area. The Confederates really, in some ways, didn't represent an enemy because they were our cousins. They were our business partners. We really didn't like the war anyway, and so why should we go and do all this work to try to resist them? Besides, we were outnumbered, and there's a general who was not. He was between assignments by the name of William B. Franklin, who was in York County at the time, and he said, if you don't do preparations, you're going to regret this. Your children will regret this because you have let them walk on soil. You'll be humiliated.
Yeah, there were just some defenses in York County itself that were at the railroad's behest, they were starting to build earthworks to protect the railroad crossing at Wrightsville. There were also rifle pits at most of the major bridges or railroad crossings throughout York County. Here in Cumberland County, where we're sitting right now, there's still a major fortification. Traces of it left at 8th and Ohio Street in Lemoyne called Fort Couch, which was one of the defenses that the New York State militia in particular was manning during the Gettysburg Campaign. So there are vestiges of the Gettysburg Campaign remaining in parts of south central Pennsylvania, including in York County.
Jim, you are a longtime newspaper editor. You, I guess, read a lot of the newspaper reports of this as it unfolded.
Right.
What's it like reading a newspaper from 1863? How did they report on it?
Yeah, it depends on what your politics were. In those days, there were Democrat papers and Republican papers, and you were there weren't general purpose newspapers at that time. So if you were a Democrat paper, you saw it only from the Democratic point of view, and and so so that's the way they would report. And the dominant paper in York at the time was the York Gazette. It was a Democratic paper. The Democrats were outnumbered Republicans in those days, so the Democratic paper was the largest paper. So they had the biggest voice, and they were very anti-Lincoln. They were the entire time, and so that was how I became engaged with the Civil War project to begin with. Was I was studying David Small, who ran the York Gazette, and he also was Chief Burgess of York, so he had that dual title. In those days, you would have a dual title.
So he's like the mayor and the editor of the newspaper.
So he could go make the news, and he could report the news that he just made. And that's exactly what happened during the Confederate invasion.
Now, you had a long-time career at the York Daily Record.
Correct.
Is that a successor in some way to the Gazette?
Yes, the York Daily Record, is a couple times removed from the York Gazette. And that was one of the reasons I got in, because I knew that was a predecessor paper. And so I kind of started studying David Small and started studying the Gazette. And there was some ownership changes, number of ownership changes since then. But we do trace our heritage at the YDR back to that moment.
Now, Scott, your book starts with the surrender of York to the Confederates, and that was controversial. Why was it controversial?
I think there are a couple reasons. Number one, York, turns out, was the largest city in the entire North, the free states, if you will, to follow the Confederate Army in the entire Civil War. Now, the controversy wasn't the fact the Confederates took the town, because they took many other places, but the controversy was the actions and behavior of some of York's leading citizens. On Saturday, June 27th, 1863, a young, early mid-20s, I guess, businessman by the name of Arthur Briggs Farquhar actually rode from York way into Adams County, right to the Adams County line, in fact, at a place called Abbottstown, and negotiated with a Confederate general on his own for the protection of women and children of York. Then he rode back to York and found out it was unauthorized, and so, as Jim mentioned, Chief Burgess Small, he and a bipartisan committee of York's leaders then rode some 10 miles west of York, about halfway or so to Abbottstown, to where the Confederates had moved during the afternoon to a new campsite at Farmers P.O. And there they negotiated for what they were hoping would be the peaceful occupation of York. So the controversy became the fact that York's leaders rode out of town seeking the Confederates to actively surrender their town, as opposed to, passively waiting in the town square like the town leaders did in Hanover, or encouraging the forces to put up a military resistance, as happened at Wrightsville.
Yeah, and in Carlisle, one of the Confederate cavalry generals, Jeb Stuart, the primary cavalry general, besieged Carlisle and asked for Carlisle to surrender, and Carlisle said refused. The general there refused. So it wasn't a given thing that you had to surrender. But York, some people say, well, Arthur Briggs Farquhar kind of played York's hands, and the leaders had to follow his lead. But it gets back to the overall politics in town was not one to be hostile to an invading army like the Confederates.
Now, in your book, you make a reference to the Confederates taking Gettysburg prior to moving into York. Had they done that?
Yeah, in fact, on Friday, June 26th, Jube Orley's division, remember, had gotten the orders on June 23rd to march east through Gettysburg and York.
And just for perspective, this is a few days before the actual Battle of Gettysburg,
Correct.
right?
The Battle of
Okay.
Gettysburg happens on July 1st through the 3rd. This is Friday, June 26th. So Jube Orley brings most of his 6,600 men to bear on either Mummasburg or Gettysburg. And in Gettysburg, they chased off one of these 7 Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia regiments, the 26th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia, captured the town during a very rainy, dismal afternoon. But Gettysburg wasn't the goal. They had no orders to stay there. So on Saturday morning, June 27th, their goal was York. So they abandoned Gettysburg and marched east.
You also have them camping overnight in Dillsburg?
There were some Confederates that camped near Dillsburg. Wade Hampton's Confederate brigade, roughly a third or so of Jeb Stuart's force that went towards Carlisle, stopped near Dillsburg and camped along Route 74, just northwest of the town.
Those 11,000 Confederates that were in York really covered every part of York, in one way or another, whether they're going out stealing food and or requisitioning food from farmers. The only part that they didn't move into was the southeastern part, the Dillsburg, Stewartstown area, which is kind of the bottom third of the county.
Was there a big evacuation that preceded the Confederates coming in?
Yeah, there were thousands of refugees that both came up today's Route 11 through Cumberland County and crossed the 2 bridges at Harrisburg. In fact, some accounts will suggest as many as 8,000 African Americans were among the tens of thousands of refugees that stormed into Harrisburg. And the equal numbers of crowds were also trying to get east towards Lancaster. And in fact, there was a traffic jam at the toll bridge in Lancaster on Saturday, June 27th, that stretched way into the countryside. And they had to, Union officer had to actually suspend the collection of tolls at Wrightsville to get this throng to disperse and get them across the river.
Were people hiding their horses?
They hit everything they could. They found hollows and places up in the mountains to try to get away. The Confederates were natural horse thieves and could find a good hiding place pretty easily. There's reports about the folks in York County burying their silverware and putting their valuables out of reach. The Confederates, for the most part, when they got into town, there was some theft that went on. They were against orders, really, not to do that, and but everything was put away. A lot of the banks moved their money over to Lancaster County and elsewhere to get out of that reach.
What did the Confederates do for food? I mean, they were pretty far from home.
Yeah, they were actually foraging off the land, so they were able to get food from private farmers from the supply. They actually did bring, of course, some supplies with them. They had herds of cattle that they had captured on the way north as they went through Virginia and Maryland, particularly in Maryland and in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. So Jube Orley, for example, when he came to York, had an entire herd of cattle came with him, but he still used part of the money that he ransomed the town for $100,000. Got $28,610 and spent some of that back with York's leading farmers and butchers to buy more meat for his men. He also requisitioned massive amounts of flour from the local flour mills, and so they were well fed in Pennsylvania.
Can you paint a picture for us of the day that the Confederate Army marched into York City?
That morning at about 10 a.m. when the population was going to church, the Confederates came into town and they marched into the, to the center square. At least one unit marched into the center square. The flag was still flying. American flag was still flying atop a 110-foot flagpole. The town had left that up. And some people argue the town hadn't surrendered because the flag was still flying. But they left the flag up, and the Confederates took down the flag. And it was an emotional moment whenever that flag came down, in part because that flag stands in the middle of Continental Square, or stood in the middle of Continental Square. 86 years before, at that very spot, right in the middle of the square, the Articles of Confederation were adopted. So that was the first Constitution of the United States. The Articles of Confederation brought the country, those 13 states, together into a confederation. And so what did that represent whenever they took down the American flag in the middle of the square? It whenever the Confederates took down the flag, it meant deconfederation. So and the people in the town understood that. They cried. There was tears. It was among at least some people. Other people, when they came into town, it was like a homecoming because again, their cousins or their kinsmen were among the Confederate troops, and so it was kind of a mixed bag. There was a 34-year-old woman by the name of Cassandra Small wrote a diary. She said there's lines that are being drawn this day. Some were welcoming the Confederates, and some realized the impact. They really realized what was going on by the Confederates being in town.
Did they raise the Confederate flag?
No, they never. They did not, and they just left the flagpole. Whether they were concerned about antagonizing the population, but they did not do that. The flagpole remained empty.
Yeah, and in fact, as they marched through town, I've never seen many accounts that they actually were even flying their flags. They typically had them furled because keep in mind, the first troops that went through at least at 10 o'clock, between 10 and 11 o'clock on Sunday, June 28th, they weren't stopping in York, they were heading to Wrightsville. So, stopping to put up a flag was certainly not something they were going to do. As the later troops arrived, as Jim mentioned, and General Early himself arrived, no, they never put up their own flags. For that reason that, again, they weren't necessarily there to conquer York. They were there to hold the town temporarily before they moved either to Gettysburg or wherever else their orders were going to take them.
Two other scenes from that. Lewis Miller, who was a folk artist, did a color drawing of that scene of the Confederates coming in and taking down the flag. The population of York, someone in York had cut the string for the flag, and so they had to, there's one account, they had to kind of someone had to go up the flagpole to get the string to pull down the flag. So it was no small thing as a tall pole. But the other thing that I should have mentioned earlier was in the very vanguard, and Miller captures this really clearly in one of his drawings, in the vanguard of the Confederate, what's called the Pioneer Corps, who were really engineers. They would clear obstructions in the road and so on. And the people looked at them, and they were, of course, grimy, and they had axes and so forth. They're coming to dig our graves.
Were there many the citizens line the streets and watch the parade come in, and were there many people who welcomed them?
Well, I mean, keep in mind this is Sunday morning. There are actually a lot of people in the streets getting ready to go to church. Some of the churches were still holding sessions. So there's an amazing contrast between these grimy, dirty, smelly Confederates that had been on the highways and roadways of Maryland and Pennsylvania for days and days and weeks and weeks, actually. And so there were a fair number of people who were already out and about. So yeah, there was a curiosity factor. There were certainly people who stayed indoors and shut their windows and shutters, but a fair amount of York's population were certainly out in the streets to watch the Confederates go by, to the point where the Confederates ended up having to post guards at every major street corner and on the sidewalks to kind of hold the people back just to make sure nobody interfered with the passage of the first troops that went through on the way to Wrightsville.
There's one account of one of the leading women in town, Mary Fisher, who was in her house, and there was a guard out in front of her house, and that's where she wrote later. She said, and we borrowed this for the title of our book, "The Dogs of War in Our Midst." That's not something that someone casually would say. There's heavy emotion there. At the same time, there was others that would collect buttons or souvenirs from the Confederates. They would meal around the Confederates, including some reports that they actually invited Confederates over for dinner.
Was there much fraternization?
Yeah, there was. The streets were full, and so there was some fear among some, but in other cases, they looked up their cousins.
Yeah, there was also several cases where curious York Countyans would come to the old fairgrounds in York, where James Carrington's battery of artillery had been parked by Jubal Early, and people came to see the big guns. They wanted to see the Confederate soldiers up close, and so you almost had this curiosity effect that people were coming out to actually see these people, whether they supported Confederate cause or not, this was a major newsworthy event. And once people were satisfied that they weren't going to be harmed, it was fairly clear that the people were certainly interacting.
Would you tell the story about Margaret Small? And she gave a bouquet of flowers to a Confederate?
Yeah. General John B. Gordon was in the vanguard moving to Wrightsville, and he was handed a bouquet of flowers along the way from a girl 10, 12 years old, in that range. And he looked at the bouquet, and there was a beautifully handwritten note that gave a lot of information, accurate information, as it turns out, about who was defending Wrightsville, which is where he was heading, who was defending the bridge at Wrightsville. And so there was some type of spy network there that deployed this young girl. Margaret Small was, it was kind of a mystery who that girl was, and someone at the York County History Center came across a name, and it was just a name, the daughter of William Small. And then they started doing a lot of doing homework and found out he only had one daughter about that age, and so that was likely. And sadly, she died about a year later. So she didn't live a life that she could tell about that incident.
Any idea who wrote the note?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was written in a woman's flowery handwriting, to use John Gordon's post-war exact words. There were certainly spies active in this region, and there were plenty of Confederate sympathizers, but the author of the note's never truly been identified. There's supposition as to who the spy might have been, but nothing's ever been proven. So to my knowledge, that'll go down as one of the undying mysteries of who actually wrote it.
So this is not just accepting or passively watching the Confederates march through. This is helping them rat out the Union.
In that case, and of course in other cases, people shuttered their houses and hunkered down. So it was very much a mixed reaction, and likely the case in point that I have in mind involved in the PA Small family, the dominant family in town, where they hunkered down in their townhouse, and they were Republicans. And so I think there was some correlation between your politics and whether you connected with the soldiers. And again, the dominant view, the dominant population in York County were Democrats. So they didn't feel in this case they didn't worry about doing that from a political point of view. The Republicans intended to.
Jim, while the Confederates were in town, did the newspapers continue to publish?
They were weekly newspapers at that time, and they published on June 30th. They published about the time that the Confederates were leaving town. One of the things that we didn't mention yet is that they were there, the Confederates were in town for about 43 hours, almost 2 days. Fairly unusual, at least in the North, to occupy a town for that long. So as they were leaving town, the newspaper said the remnants of the Confederates are now heading out of town. So that was Tuesday, June 30th. And in that paper, there was an account of the occupation. The paper owned by the Chief Burgess, the man who played a role, maybe a big role, in surrendering the town.
How did the Republican newspaper report on it?
The Republican newspaper, really at first, it was about 2 weeks later, they just kind of picked up some of what was in the Gazette, the Democratic paper. But the criticism of the surrender came in immediately. It came in the Harrisburg paper, the Republican Harrisburg paper launched against the Copperheads of York and papers outside of the area. And the town's fathers felt they took to the Gazette to try to defend that action. We were undefended. We did what we thought was right. And really, it was a decision. You always have to try to avoid the idea of looking back, presentism, where you look with today's eyes back there unfairly. But you would have to look back at that moment and say York really did draw a line in the sand. If the York area would have said, as Hanover did, as Scott talked about Hanover, at Carlisle, where you kind of are ambivalent, or you are used passive aggressive. You don't go seek out the enemy and surrender. You know, if we had done something like Hanover in York, I think the town would be different now, because the discussion on the Civil War didn't take root really through much of the 20th century. It wasn't really, a point of emphasis, or even at the 100th anniversary in 1963, the newspaper just ran just a report, brought back old material, didn't do any analysis, or there was no activities to cover in York. And so, it wasn't until about 1987, on our 125th anniversary, that the Civil War discussion started again. And then with Scott's books and so on, after 2000, it's a main focus of study in York now. But I think that there is something, because in the 20th century in particular, in the late 1800s, because we didn't really focus on the Civil War, we focused on the American Revolution. We had that Articles of Confederation thing going. We were proud of that, and we should have been. When you don't talk about the Civil War and the causes of it and the whys of it, you don't talk about race. And I think the two are bundled. And so York didn't really have a discussion about race. The Civil War discussion would have just brought that up, brought that out. And so we're behind on discussion on race, and I think we still are.
Was there a very big African-American population in York in Civil War time?
Yeah, I think the number was 1,800 out of 68,000. So, the York population as a percentage, African-Americans as a percentage of population, has remained pretty steady throughout history. And so there was about 2,000 African-Americans in York at the time. As the Confederates came into the county, probably few of them were there, as Scott has already mentioned. They would have moved across the river because the Confederates were known, and everybody knew that they would send, if they were captured, even a freedman, they would send them back to the South.
Many African Americans in York County joined the Army?
Scott, you want to talk about the 54th on that?
Yeah, several men from York and Lancaster County, actually, in response to appeals by Frederick Douglass, had traveled to Massachusetts during the late spring of 1863 and enrolled in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Infantry, which were some of the very celebrated early Civil War black units raised in the North, at least. And so there were York Countyans who were actively seeking to join the Army, but by the laws of the country at that time, and also by the state laws and things, the African Americans were not being enrolled into regular military units. So a number of people took the matters under their own hands. In fact, there were 53 African American men, black men, who worked largely at the rolling mill in Columbia, crossed the river, got guns from the state militiamen, and actually engaged in the defense of Wrightsville. It wasn't until late July, early August of 1863, until after the Battle of Gettysburg, that the federal government then began formally enlisting men in what was called the United States Colored Troops. And a fair number of York Countyans actually then in the summer of 1863 signed up for formal military service.
Yeah, we counted 6 or 7 African Americans with York County ties who served in the 54th, the famous 54th on Fort Wagner that the movie Gloria was based around. One of those workers from Columbia that Scott referred to was the only fatality, the only mortality in the fighting at Wrightsville. Gordon came to the bridge, tried to take the bridge. The Union forces burned the bridge, so Gordon couldn't get across, the Confederates couldn't get across. And in that skirmish, one of the African Americans from Columbia who was digging the trenches picked up his musket and was facing off against this veteran Confederate onslaught. And he was decapitated by a cannonball and died. He was the only mortality of that battle. And interestingly, he was forgotten. We don't know his identity today. Another one of those mysteries. Interestingly, just north of Wrightsville, along the river, there was a Confederate soldier, a dead Confederate soldier found. And over the years, his grave was marked. We don't know who he is, but his grave was marked, and several tombstones have been placed there, markers have been placed there over the years. So he was recognized. Until 2013, there was no recognition of this black fighting man in Wrightsville or in York County, no recognition of his heroism. And then in 2013, there was the American Legion in York, the African American Legion in York said, we're going to recognize him. And they did. They got a large stone and put him in an African American cemetery in Wrightsville.
Another African American soldier you write about is John Aquila Wilson.
Right.
Who is he, and how did he come into your attention?
Well, John Aquila Wilson was a 15-year-old at the time of the Gettysburg Campaign. He worked in the rolling mill, and he was one of these 53 free black men and boys, in this case, that volunteered to help start by digging trenches in Wrightsville to help defend the town. And then, as mentioned, the state militia gave these guys guns. They didn't have uniforms, but they had plenty of courage. And so he ended up fighting in the trenches of Wrightsville. Then he was one of the men that joined the U.S. colored troops once they were formally organized. And he would go on to be the last Civil War veteran who had been raised in York County to die in York County. When he died, I think, Jim, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around the World War II time frame.
About 1942. He's 101 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you both referred to Wrightsville. Can you, for people who are not familiar with it, can you explain how Wrightsville fit into the whole picture?
Yeah, that's Wrightsville is about 10 to 12 miles east of York, depending on where you draw York's boundaries today. But it was important standpoint. It sat on the Susquehanna River on the today's U.S. Route 30, on the easternmost part of York County along that road, fronting Columbia, Pennsylvania. Now, the importance of Wrightsville was the fact that from Harrisburg south to Conowingo, Maryland, there was only one bridge, and that was between Wrightsville and Columbia. So that became an important part of the overall Confederate strategy. And again, initially to burn the bridge to keep reinforcements to come from Philadelphia in interfering with the Confederate plans to fight a major battle somewhere in south central Pennsylvania. But as it turns out, that bridge ended up, Confederates wanted to take it, and the Union ended up burning it. So they kind of flip-flopped their positions.
Yeah, it's interesting that there was a skirmish, there was fighting, there was resistance in Wrightsville. There was a major cavalry clash in Hanover, and there was fighting elsewhere in York County, and that's part of the York story. There wasn't in York because of the surrender. And so when there's a celebration like in 1963, there'd be newspaper coverage of the Wrightsville skirmish, the Battle of Hanover, but nothing in York.
In fact, they had major reenactments in both Hanover and in Wrightsville where significant numbers of out-of-staters even came to those two communities to watch the mock or sham battles that were taking place. But as Jim mentioned, there was no such thing in downtown York.
Do you find some almost embarrassment today that among people in York that they didn't put up more of a fuss?
Well, I think that is part of the identity, that we can point to American Revolution successes, World War II successes, but in the York area, not to Civil War. And it's too bad. And one of the things that we've tried to do, and this is Scott and my fourth collaboration, we've tried to bring the significant things that did happen in York, the U.S. military hospital, major U.S. military hospital in York. There was a camp for green troops and tens of thousands of green troops early in the war. So York was significantly involved in the Civil War. It just, at this time frame, it kind of subsumed everything else. It sucked the oxygen out of the historical narrative for decades, and now it's being discovered or rediscovered.
Yeah, to add to that, what Jim just said, he mentioned the United States Army Hospital in York, which frankly, Yorkers should be far more proud of this facility than I think most people even are. During the course of the Civil War, 14,000 wounded or ill men were treated at York. It was one of the larger military hospitals in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But it was the safest U.S. military hospital in the entire country. Out of those 14,000 men, only 200 or so actually ended up dying at that facility, making it an incredibly safe facility, one that men wanted to go to York because they had a higher chance of recovery in that hospital. And part of that was due to the workings of the Major Henry Palmer, who ran the hospital the first 2 years. Later, a co-founder of the American Medical Association and the General Hospital of Milwaukee, but his forefront and innovative practices of that hospital led to a safety record, and we almost never talk about that as one of the triumphs, if you will, of York during the Civil War.
Yeah, and today you'll hear some people argue, as they did at the time, that it was a business decision. You surrendered to try to keep the town intact and the people intact in the town, so of course it's defensible. And then you could argue, well, you give up your honor, you seek out the enemy in a military theater. You give up your honor when you do that. And another thing that we, in terms of what York gave, and this is often overlooked, more than 600 fighting men died in battle or in camp. So it was a major sacrifice. It was such disruption in York County, and I'm sure it was elsewhere in the war too. I know it was, that they built an orphanage after the war. At the end of the war, so the families were terribly disrupted. And an interesting point is, in 1864, they could take those in the military, the fighting men, could vote, and the York vote among York units was York backed Lincoln in 1864. The York soldiers backed Lincoln in 1864. The county did not. The fighting men did. Interesting dynamic there.
Now, when the Battle of Gettysburg took place, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, how was the effect felt in York County?
I think there were a couple impacts. Number one, a lot of the ladies of York, Jim had mentioned Mary Fisher earlier, who coined the term "the dogs of war" in our midst. She helped organize a number of York women that actually were raising supplies. Wagon loads of supplies were coming in from all corners of York County to a central assembly point in York, and from there they were being taken and ferried west to York. Mary Fisher herself went over as a nurse to help with some of the wounded after the battle. Arthur Briggs Farquhar, the man who precipitated the surrender of York himself, went to Gettysburg on July 2nd. He was actually present for part of the battle, and he was working to help carry the wounded off of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill after the Battle of Gettysburg. So the county reacted fairly strongly. Again, for a county that didn't really vote for Lincoln, they certainly were willing to support taking care of the wounded. And then more than 1,000 wounded soldiers from the Battle of Gettysburg were brought here to York in the U.S. Army Hospital, and the townspeople helped feed them. They helped take care of them. And here's the irony. In Hanover, a town that had a Republican newspaper as the dominant newspaper, the townspeople weren't as thrilled to have to take care of the wounded after the Battle of Hanover as York, a Democratic town, was after the Battle of Gettysburg. So the ironies and the dichotomies in this county continue to amaze me.
Yeah, throughout the war, the women of York were very supportive of the hospital. They were supportive of the Camp Scott, where the Green troops were trained early in the war. So it's kind of like you hate the war, but you love the warrior. And that applied at least in the York area and throughout the county.
If you visit downtown York today, what looks the same as it did when the Confederate troops marched through?
Yeah, some of the signature buildings are still there. For example, there's a building on on the square called the Hartman Building, which has varied in height from 5 to 6 stories over the years, and that would have been front and center whenever the Confederates came into town. They would have been amazed. In fact, they were amazed at the buildings in York, and they were amazed at the size of the barns throughout York County. They were coming from the South. They weren't used to those large bank barns that we had up here. The barns pointing to the prosperity of the area, the rich farmland in the area. So there was another thing that has not been evident until recently was things that point out, in modern days to the Confederate occupation. There were in the York Square, there's something like 13 markers or some type of nods towards American Revolution, towards with the courthouse being in the square. But until in the last 10 years, there's only been about a couple signs that have gone up in the square. In the York area, there's only 2 Civil War monuments, Union monuments, one at Penn Park and another one at a small park in the West End. So York, in many ways, though, York's catching up as the Civil War discussion has gone on. Hanover has a significant signage program going down there. There's a signage program that Scott's part of out in Wrightsville, to try to explain what went on.
We only have a minute or two left. Scott, you get the last word.
Okay, well, yeah, obviously we want to talk about the fact that, despite York, surrendering probably the one aspect that people think about the most when they think of York County during the Civil War, this was a county filled with a lot of surprises. There were a number of Confederates that marveled, again, as Jim mentioned, at just how prosperous and how well-developed and how advanced this county was.
Well, we are out of time. We've been speaking with Scott Mingus and James McClure, and they are the authors of this book, The Dogs of War in Our Midst, Civil War Perspectives from York County, Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.